What stories about WW2 did your grandparents tell you, and or what did you find out about their lives during that period? He never said much, but he did talk once about throwing explosives of some kind in a river to catch fish. He was in the South Pacific as a Marine. I just remembered another one. He did not smoke, so he traded his cigarettes till he had enough for a typewriter, so he could type his letters to his wife and my mom, his daughter, who was born after he went to war. My grandfather joined up in 1943 when he turned 18 years old. He was stationed on a Pacific island where he basically became a radar O'Reilly. His family were Mennonites, so he was a conscientious objector. He was a medic, clerical worker, cook, ditch digger, driver, and anything else that he was asked. Most of his time was spent cleaning up after everyone else and watching for air raids by the Japanese Air Force. Edit. My mom said that he watched the Japanese planes surrender on the USS Missouri. One grandfather was in the AIF, fighting in the jungles of Papua New Guinea on the infamous Kokoda track. He had nightmares about his experiences for the duration of his life and only spoke about it to me briefly when I was a kid. He mentioned that he would often cut his own path through the thick jungle because the Japanese would hide up in the trees and ambush them. He wasn't a fan of the bully beef and was constantly soaked through due to torrential rain and mud. He never smoked, but would win cigarettes off his mates in card games, then light them and hang them from the entrance to his tent to help keep the swarms of mosquitoes away. He also coldly told me that the Japanese killed all his friends. He helped build some of the jungle runways for the American planes to later land. He said that once the Americans came, things began to improve. My other grandfather was in the Royal Navy, in the Arctic convoys, delivering much needed supplies to the Russians in Murmansk. Winston Churchill described the convoys as the worst journey in the world. My grandfather initially put his life jacket on as trained to do, when one of the older sailors laughed and told him, "Don't worry about it, son, you'll freeze to death in under a minute anyway." They'd often have to chip away the thick ice on ships to prevent them capsizing. His ship was involved in numerous battles against larger, heavier armed German ships, as well as U-boats and planes. He told me how his ship had to use its last remaining torpedo to scuttle fellow crippled Royal Navy ship, HMS Edinburgh, which was carrying heaps of gold bullion from Stalin, to prevent it slipping into enemy hands. The gold was salvaged in the 1980s. My grandfather befriended a German family during the war. They would cook him meals, and the mother would wash his clothes. One day he loaded up a box with eggs and used toilet paper to make sure they didn't break. The next day there was a note in his laundry thanking him for the eggs, but an even bigger thank you for the toilet paper. They hadn't had any in years. I had an great uncle who was part of the occupying forces in Germany. He loved dogs and purchased a full-blooded German Shepherd while overseas. He couldn't keep the dog with him, so he had a German family look after the dogs. Meat was hard to come by, so every week or so, my uncle would bring the family meat to feed the dog. It was only after getting the dog home my uncle discovered the dog absolutely loved sauerkraut and didn't quite know what to do with the meat. It turns out the German family was taking the meat for the dog and eating it themselves and feeding the dog sauerkraut. My granduncle was part of a cleanup crew in Japan after the Battle of Leyte. So after all the fighting was done, they'd sent his unit in to clear out the bodies of the fallen Japanese. He said that they would loot their bodies, take treasures like knives, swords, gold off the teeth, and then put their bodies on a giant landing craft, the kind that open up on a beach, and take them out to sea to dispose of them. He says he'll never forget watching the sharks just go to town on the dead. Haunts him to this day. Grandfather was drafted, broke his femur in basic training. Spent the entirety of World War II behind a desk in Oklahoma processing logistics and supply chain management requests. My grandpa had a similar accident. Was sent to Berlin. Happened to be working on the roof, and someone forgot he was up there and moved the ladder. He slipped, snapped a tendon, and wound up being trained as a medical assistant. Unfortunately, this meant he saw a lot of bad stuff, including having to treat a good friend who then died. He suffered from PTSD and depression the rest of his life, but was a wonderful grandpa. He had trouble talking about the war, so rarely did. While he was in Berlin, he fell in love with a German girl and asked her father for permission to marry her. He was told no, because not only was he American, but he was Italian, which was even worse to the father. After the war, he stayed in Germany for 2 years to help clean up. He said the people were nice. He never had anything bad to say about them. But that's kind of how he was. I think maybe that came from growing up around criminals and understanding people can be both good and bad. His family was in the Mafia and ran a front in Brooklyn, and prior to that, a brothel. He went to Pratt when it was still affordable, so he could become an engineer. He went on to become an aerospace engineer and was a talented woodworker. His grandpa was a woodworker who sold his furniture on the side. He married my grandma, taking in her 2 kids. They bought a house using the GI Bill. Then they had my mom. They were together for 46 years. He survived cancer 3 times. He lived to be 86. It's been 8 years since he passed, and we all still really miss him. His favorite cartoon to watch with me was Hey Arnold, because it reminded him of Brooklyn, and he used to tell me about the homing pigeons he trained on his roof, just like Pigeon Man. Edit. Wow, since this blew up, I'll tell you more. My grandpa was born in 1926 in New York City. His father and aunt grew up in a brothel, run by their father and stepmother. Their BO mom died shortly after giving birth. I actually have a photo of the brothel, with my great-great-grandpa, his wife, my great-grandpa and sister together on the stoop from the 1910s. In the 1930s, my grandpa's family moved to Brooklyn. They opened up a soda fountain. They used it to launder money. My great-grandpa ran the local lottery and sold drugs. My great-grandma sold bathtub gin and was unfortunately mentally ill. She was frequently hospitalized for manic depression. A few years ago, my grandpa's sister called me and told me some amazing stories from when they all lived in Brooklyn together. She said a few days before her wedding, 1950s, my grandpa was apprehended by the police on the street. They tried to pressure him into telling them what their father was up to. My aunt asked him to make sure their father wasn't jailed so that he would be present at her wedding. So my grandpa went to their father and told him. He got there in time for my great-grandpa to hide any evidence. The police eventually showed up and found nothing of use. My aunt said she had thanked my grandpa for that favor, as she begged him to help hide things so that their father would be at her wedding and not in jail. She got married, and their father was there and had a happy marriage and 3 kids. My great-grandparents' crimes went on into the 1970s, and then they passed away, and that was that. We did take my grandpa back to his old homes in Brooklyn a few years before he passed, and he cried. He said he loved Brooklyn so much and wished he never left it. For those of you from New York City, you'll know that Park Slope, Bay Ridge, and Borough Park are very expensive now. The dilapidated homes he once lived in, with about 12 people in them at a time, Grandpa slept on the enclosed porch, are now worth millions. My mom says my great-grandpa was a nice man and spoiled her and my great-grandma. She said if there was a piece of jewelry my great-grandma wanted in a window, he'd buy it for her. He also used to bring my mom chocolate and treats. I asked her how he could have been so nice to her if he was a criminal, and she shrugged and said that people had to do what they did back then because they had no skills and no one would hire Italians but Italians. I also asked my mom how it was to grow up with her grandparents, and she said it was weird knowing what a PO box was and betting on the horses at Belmont as a kid.